Today I want to tell you a story about how, in the unforgiving wilderness of the American West, a solitary woman's fight for survival is upended by the sudden appearance of a warrior from a tribe she was taught to fear. When a silent truce between them blossoms into a forbidden bond, they must risk everything to escape a world that wants them both dead. The Montana sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the endless sea of grass and turning the distant mountains into hazy, shimmering apparitions. Eleanor Vance wiped a thin film of dust and sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her knuckles chapped and raw from endless work. The old Winchester rifle felt like a permanent extension of her arm, a heavy but necessary companion in this vast, crushing emptiness that had become her world. Her simple calico dress, once of vibrant blue, had long since faded to the color of the dusty sky, its fabric worn thin and patched in a dozen places. 2 years. A lifetime. 2 years since Samuel had kissed her goodbye, his cavalry uniform seeming so proud and strong against the backdrop of their small, hopeful cabin, a structure that now seemed to mock her with its silent endurance. 2 years since his letters, once filled with promises of a swift return, had dwindled to nothing, leaving a void that the wind could not fill. Silence was her constant neighbor now, a presence so profound it seemed to have its own weight and texture. The ceaseless wind whispering through the prairie grass was the only reply to the questions she no longer dared to ask aloud, questions that withered in the heat of the day. Rumors carried by the rare trapper or merchant passing through on their way to nowhere were all she had. These were grim, weathered men who looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They brought disjointed tales of brutal skirmishes with Comanche war parties, of chilling ambushes and treacherous mountain passes, of entire patrols swallowed whole by the unforgiving wilderness, leaving not a button or a boot behind. Dead or alive, the thought came to her unbidden, a bitter taste in her mouth. The land did not care for such distinctions. Survival was the only truth it acknowledged, and so she had learned to do the same, pushing memories of Samuel's laugh into a locked room in her heart. Her stomach rumbled, a sharp, insistent reminder of her immediate purpose. A prairie grouse, plump and foolishly bold, pecked at seeds a short distance away, its head bobbing in blissful ignorance. It was a meager prospect for a meal, but a significant improvement over the wild roots and tough greens that had been her primary diet for the past week. She moved with a practiced stillness that the wilderness had painfully taught her, a slow, deliberate grace that belied the fire of hunger inside. Raising the heavy Winchester to her shoulder, she aligned the worn metal sight, her breath held tight in her chest, trying to still the tremor in her hands. The world narrowed to that small bird, the metal of the trigger cool and solid against her finger. Just as she prepared to squeeze, a faint whistling sound cut through the air, impossibly fast, followed by a soft, definitive thud. The grouse collapsed in a puff of dust, a single, dark-feathered arrow protruding from its side. Eleanor froze, every muscle tensed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to break free. She was not alone. From a fold in the rolling hills, a place she had thought empty seconds before, a figure emerged. He moved with the silent, startling fluidity of a mountain cat, his presence a sudden tear in the fabric of her solitude. He was tall and lean, his skin the color of burnished copper, his long black hair unbound and stirring in the breeze. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a vest, his muscled arms bare and powerful. A Comanche warrior. He was the enemy from the terrifying stories, the reason Samuel had ridden away into the haze of the horizon. He met her gaze across the clearing, his dark eyes unreadable but intensely intelligent. For a long, silent moment, they simply stared, two solitary figures under the vast, indifferent sky. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, retrieved the grouse and laid it carefully on the ground between them before turning and melting back into the landscape as silently and mysteriously as he had appeared. His name was Kael, though he rarely spoke it now to another living soul. The wind and the stars knew him, and that had become enough. He had grown weary of the path of war, a blood-soaked trail that seemed to only lead to more graves dug in the hard earth, for both his people and for the white settlers who came in an endless tide. The ceaseless cycle of raids and brutal reprisals had hollowed something essential out inside him, leaving a quiet, persistent ache where a warrior's fire had once burned with pride. 3 moons ago, he had walked away from his band, not in an act of cowardice, but in a desperate search for a silence that was not constantly filled with the ghosts of the dead and the echoes of battle cries. He sought a different way, a trail his elders would call foolish and weak, but one his spirit demanded he follow. The violence had become a language he no longer wished to speak, its words tasting of ash and sorrow. He had watched her for many days from the high, grassy ridges, this solitary woman with eyes the color of the clear summer sky after a storm. She was unlike the others of her kind he had observed. They came with sharp metal plows that scarred the earth, like open wounds, and axes that silenced the ancient, whispering forests. But she moved with a quiet respect that spoke to him. She took only what she needed to survive, her steps light upon the land, her gaze watchful and aware, like a doe sensing the slightest change in the wind. He saw the profound loneliness that clung to her like a shroud, a haunting mirror of his own chosen isolation. And he had seen her raise her rifle that day, the sun glinting off the long barrel. She could have ended him. But she had hesitated, and in that split-second hesitation, he saw not weakness, but a strength of spirit he recognized and respected. A silent, tentative conversation began between them, carried on the currents of the prairie wind. A few days after their first startling encounter, Kael left a brace of freshly caught rabbits near her woodpile, their dark forms a stark offering against the graying, weathered timber. He then retreated to his hidden vantage point and watched as she eventually discovered them. He saw her immediate caution, the way she circled the offering, her rifle held at the ready as she scanned the empty horizon. He saw her deep hesitation, a conflict playing out in the rigid set of her shoulders, and finally her slow acceptance as she carried the gift inside. It was a test, a question asked without words. Would her ingrained fear rule her, or would a different, more courageous kind of understanding prevail? The answer came a day later, and it surprised him with its simple dignity. Eleanor struggled mightily with the warrior's gesture. It was an act of inexplicable kindness that she could not reconcile with the terrifying stories whispered around campfires and printed in newspapers. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, warred with a desperate, deeply human need for some form of connection in her desolate world. After a long night of restless, troubled thought, she made a decision born of instinct rather than logic. She walked to the large, flat rock that marked the edge of her small clearing, a place clearly visible from the surrounding hills. There she left a small bundle of her own, a precious pouch of good tobacco she had been saving for Samuel's eventual return, and a finely sharpened skinning knife she valued greatly. It was nearly all she had of worth to offer, a small token of gratitude, an acknowledgement that they were two people, not just two faceless enemies, trying to survive in the same harsh, beautiful world. The fragile piece of their unspoken arrangement held for weeks, establishing a quiet, comforting rhythm in the vast, empty wilderness. The gifts continued, a silent testament to a growing, if exceedingly cautious, trust between two people from warring worlds. But the frontier was a place of sudden, brutal change, a landscape that offered no guarantees. One sweltering afternoon, Eleanor took her meager laundry down to the creek that snaked through a shallow, rocky ravine. As she knelt by the cool, clear water, scrubbing a stubborn stain from her worn apron, a sudden, sharp, and fiery pain seared her forearm. She cried out in shock and agony, scrambling backward as a prairie rattlesnake, thick as her wrist and patterned with diamonds of dust and death, slithered away into the rocks, its warning rattle a chilling, venomous sound in the still, hot air. 2 small, dark puncture marks on her arm began to swell and discolor almost immediately. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over her, more potent and immediate than any fear she had known in her 2 years of solitude. Alone, miles from any conceivable help, with deadly venom coursing through her veins, she knew precisely what this meant. She stumbled to her feet, her gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering shape of her cabin, a sanctuary that now seemed a world away. A wave of intense dizziness swept over her, the landscape tilting and spinning violently. Her legs buckled without warning, and she collapsed to her knees, the sun-baked earth seeming to rush up to meet her with a hard finality. She fought to stay conscious, knowing instinctively that to surrender to the encroaching, cloying darkness was to surrender to death itself. With a desperate sob, she began to crawl, each movement sending a fresh wave of fire and agony up her rapidly numbing arm. She had not managed to drag herself 10 yards when strong, steady hands gripped her shoulders, halting her desperate, painful progress. Through a vision that was already blurring and fragmenting at the edges, she looked up into the stoic, worried face of Kael. He had appeared from the shadows of the ravine as if summoned by her silent scream of terror. He spoke to her in his own tongue, the words low and urgent, but she could not comprehend their meaning through the fog of pain. He seemed to realize the futility of speech, his dark, intelligent eyes assessing the rapidly swelling wound with an expert gaze. He saw the bluish, unhealthy tint spreading across her skin, the violent tremor in her limbs. He knew her simple home remedies would be useless against such a potent and fast-acting poison. This was a death she could not outrun. Without another word, he lifted her as easily as if she were a child. Eleanor wanted to protest, to cling to the fierce, stubborn independence that had kept her alive for 2 long years. But the venom had stolen her strength and scattered her thoughts like dry leaves in the wind. A feeling of utter, terrifying helplessness washed over her as she was carried away from the direction of her home. "Cabin!" she managed to whisper, her voice thin and reedy, pointing weakly with her good hand. Medicine. But he was not taking her to the cabin. He moved with a swift, sure-footed purpose toward the higher, rockier ground of the foothills. She tried to struggle, a feeble, desperate motion, but her limbs felt like lead, unresponsive to her will. The last thing she remembered was his calm, low voice, speaking words she did not understand, but that somehow conveyed a profound reassurance as the world finally went completely black. Eleanor awoke to the soft, gentle flicker of firelight dancing on a ceiling of solid rock. A dull, persistent throbbing in her arm had replaced the terrible, all-consuming burning, and she was surprised to find that the feeling was slowly returning to her numb fingers. She turned her head, her movements slow and sluggish, taking in her strange surroundings. She was in a small, deep cave, its entrance partially hidden by a natural curtain of tangled brush and vines. A small, nearly smokeless fire burned brightly in a stone-lined pit, casting warm, shifting shadows on the walls. Beside the fire, watchful and perfectly still, sat Kael. When he saw her eyes open, he leaned forward, offering her a carved wooden cup filled with a dark, steaming liquid. She hesitated, her ingrained fear and suspicion still present, a wary ghost in the dim, unfamiliar light of the cave. He seemed to understand her deep-seated reluctance. Without a change in his calm expression, he took a small sip from the cup himself, a clear gesture of trust, then extended it to her once again. Reassured by this simple act, Eleanor struggled to push herself up, accepting the offering with her good hand. The liquid was bitter and earthy, with a strange, not unpleasant aroma, but it soothed her raw, parched throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice a hoarse, cracked whisper. He nodded, then reached for her injured arm. She allowed him to examine it, her eyes widening in stunned surprise. The angry, purple swelling was much reduced. A thick, dark poultice of crushed green leaves and some kind of dark, cool earth covered the bite marks, held securely in place by strips of clean, soft hide. "You saved my life," she said, the simple, undeniable truth of it hanging in the quiet, intimate air between them. "Snake medicine is strong," he replied, his English slow, careful, and heavily accented, surprising her more than the potent remedy. "You are a strong woman. You will live." The sound of his voice, speaking her own language, was a greater shock than the medicine itself. It created a bridge where there had only been silence. "You speak English," she stated, unable to hide the profound wonder in her voice. A deep shadow crossed his face, a flicker of old, remembered pain in his dark eyes. From a school, long ago, before the fighting became endless, an awkward, heavy silence fell between them, the unspoken history of their two peoples, a tangible presence in the small, warm cave. "My name is Eleanor," she offered finally, wanting to fill the silence with something new, something that was just hers. "Eleanor Vance." He considered her words for a long moment, as if weighing the trust she had offered him with her name. "My people call me Kael," he said at last, his voice low and resonant. "It means one who listens to the wind." A faint, rare smile touched the corners of his lips, softening the stern lines of his face. "It is a quiet name, for a quiet life." Eleanor found herself smiling in return, the simple expression feeling unfamiliar and strange on her own face after so long. "Thank you, Kael," she said again, her voice stronger now. "For the gifts and for this," she gestured to her treated arm. He rose fluidly in one smooth motion to tend the fire. "Rest," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "The night comes. Tomorrow I will take you back to your home." As he moved about the cave, she saw him not as a savage, but as a man who had shown her a profound and unexpected mercy, an act that defied everything she thought she knew. As autumn painted the vast plains in deep hues of gold and rust, a cautious, fragile friendship bloomed in the shelter of the foothills. Kael did not take her home the next day as he had promised. He insisted the poison could return with a vengeance, that she needed his medicine and his watchfulness for a while longer. A quiet, unspoken routine settled between them. By day he taught her to read the subtle signs of the wilderness, the hidden language of tracks, broken twigs and the flight of birds. She, in turn, read to him in the evenings from her treasured book of poetry, the lyrical words painting vivid pictures of a world of towering cities and boundless oceans that he could barely imagine. They began to speak of their pasts in careful, hesitant fragments, with each shared story becoming another plank in the bridge they were building across the deep chasm of their differences. Kael spoke of a childhood spent learning the sacred ways of the Comanche, a time of freedom and reverence for the land, a time before the endless wars had poisoned everything. He spoke of the missionary school with a detached, lingering sadness, describing it as a place that had given him a new language but had tried to take his soul in exchange. Eleanor described her long journey west with Samuel, their shared, hopeful dream of a new beginning far away from the sickness and sorrow that had claimed her parents back in Ohio. They never touched, save for the brief, clinical moments when Kael tended her healing arm, but an undeniable current grew between them, a powerful connection felt and shared. Lingering glances across the fire, and in the comfortable silences that were no longer empty but full of a deep, unspoken understanding of each other's loneliness. Their peaceful, isolated interlude was shattered one crisp morning by the distant, rhythmic sound of multiple hoofbeats. Visitors were a profound rarity and almost always a harbinger of trouble. Kael moved instantly, melting into the deepest shadows of the cave like a ghost, while Eleanor, now strong enough to walk with confidence, cautiously peered through the curtain of brush at the entrance. 3 riders approached from the east, their figures stark and menacing against the bright morning horizon. As they drew closer, her heart sank with a cold certainty. She recognized the stocky, imposing form of Silas Croft, the aggressive owner of the trading post 40 miles away. With him were 2 uniformed soldiers, their faces hard and grim, their eyes constantly scanning the landscape. Croft had made his unwanted interest in her plane during her rare visits for supplies, his offers of protection growing more insistent and unsettling each time. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," Croft called out, his voice booming with false friendliness as they reined in their horses a short distance from her cabin, which was clearly visible down in the small valley below. His possessive gaze swept over the small homestead lingering on the signs of recent activity, the repaired fence, the well-tended garden. "Seems you are doing mighty well for yourself out here all alone." Eleanor remained hidden, her hand resting on the old rifle Kael had left with her for protection. The senior soldier spoke then, his voice sharp and carrying on the clear air. "Ma'am, we have had reliable reports of Comanche activity in these hills. It is not safe for a woman alone." Croft's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Hiram Johnson was hunting up here last week, swears he saw smoke from 2 different fires, and not just from your chimney." Eleanor felt a sudden, profound chill that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. They were not just patrolling, they were looking for Kael. She had to warn him, to make him understand the gravity of the danger. That evening, after the riders had finally moved on, their parting words a thinly veiled threat to return, she spoke to him, her voice tight with a new and urgent fear. "They suspect. They are not just passing through, they know someone is helping me." Kael's expression darkened, his face becoming an impassive mask that hid his thoughts. "I saw them," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I watched from the high rocks. They hunt my people." He knew men like Croft and the soldiers all too well. They saw the land only as something to be conquered, and its people as obstacles to be ruthlessly removed. He knew their presence meant the end of the quiet, solitary life he had sought. "Croft is coming back," she said, her voice barely a whisper, forcing the words out. "He said he would return. Alone." She did not need to explain his foul intentions. The predatory look in the trader's eyes had been unmistakable and deeply unsettling. A dangerous, cold light flared in Kael's gaze. "This man threatens you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous, each word spoken with precision. "Not with words," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly. "But he will not take no for an answer much longer." She hesitated, then added the most chilling news of all. "The soldiers, they are offering money, bounties, for capturing your people." The casual, brutal cruelty of it made her feel sick to her stomach. It turned men into predators and turned human lives into currency, a cold and simple transaction of death. "I must go," Kael said, his jaw tight with a controlled anger. "It is not safe for you here now. Or for me. My presence puts you in the shadow of the rope." He looked north, toward the distant, formidable mountains that were already dusted with the first snows of winter. "I will go to the high country. It is safer there for men like them." Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp panic seize her heart at the thought of his leaving. The idea of returning to her crushing, absolute solitude after these weeks of quiet companionship was simply unbearable. The silence she had once merely endured now seemed like a terrifying, living threat, ready to consume her whole. "I will miss our talks," she said softly, the simple words feeling hopelessly inadequate to express the deep chasm that was opening at her feet. Kael turned to her, his gaze intense and searching in the fading twilight. He saw the raw fear and quiet despair in her eyes, a stark reflection of the turmoil raging in his own heart. "Come with me," he said, the words emerging unplanned, surprising them both with their sudden, irrevocable weight. "What?" she breathed, her eyes wide with shock. "Come with me," he repeated, his voice filled with a new and powerful urgency. "There is nothing for you here but danger. Croft will return. Others will come. They will not leave you in peace." He gestured toward her small, lonely cabin below, a tiny speck in the vast landscape. "This place, it is a cage of memories and ghosts. In the mountains, we can survive the winter. Together." The offer hung in the charged air, a terrifying, exhilarating choice between the dying life she knew and a future she could not possibly imagine. The decision, once made, settled in her heart with a strange and profound sense of rightness, of destiny. What, after all, was she truly leaving behind? A ghost of a husband who was never returning, and a hostile society that saw her as either a prize to be claimed or a problem to be solved. For 3 days they worked with a quiet, frantic energy that masked their deep anxiety. Eleanor sorted through her meager possessions with ruthless practicality, choosing only what was essential for survival. Knives, cooking pots, her small store of medicine, and the small, worn book of poetry that had become a source of solace. Kael hunted relentlessly, smoking the meat, and taught her how to craft sturdy snowshoes from rawhide and bent branches. A silent, powerful understanding flowed between them, the shared purpose a bond that needed no words to strengthen it. On the 3rd morning, Eleanor awoke before dawn with a feeling of grim, heart-pounding finality. Today they would leave. As the first pale gray light crept over the eastern horizon, she heard the sound she had been dreading, the heavy, unmistakable rumble of approaching horses. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was too early. Croft was not due until the afternoon. She peered through a small crack in the cabin wall and her blood ran cold. It was not 1 rider, but 5. Croft had returned, and he had not come alone. He was flanked by the 2 soldiers and 2 other men, their faces hard and cruel, their gear marking them as professional bounty hunters, men who dealt in death for a living. "Eleanor, open up." Croft's voice boomed across the clearing, thick with a false, sickening cheerfulness. "We have some wonderful news for you." She took a deep, steadying breath, schooling her features into a mask of cold indifference, before slowly unbolting the door. "Mr. Croft," she said coolly, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. "You are early." He grinned, a predator's smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "We found signs of a small Comanche camp up in the canyons. Fresh tracks, leading right this way." His eyes glinted with a sharp, ugly malice. "You would not know anything about that, would you?" The older soldier, Willis, stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the area. "Ma'am, we tracked a lone brave to within a mile of this cabin. The tracks show he has been coming this way regularly." "My cabin is near the only reliable spring in these hills," she replied evenly, her hand tightening on the rough wood of the doorframe until her knuckles were white. All manner of creatures pass by to drink. Croft's smile vanished, replaced by a hard, impatient scowl. "We aim to set a trap. My men will hide out in the rocks and wait for him to show himself. You will go about your business as normal." The vile threat was clear. She was to be the bait to lure Kael to his death. "And if I refuse?" she challenged, her voice low and defiant. Croft's expression hardened into something truly ugly. "Then we will have to wonder why a good, God-fearing woman would protect a savage over her own kind. Some might even say you have gone native." The words hung in the air, a death sentence in this unforgiving land, spoken as casually as a comment about the weather. "You have no right to be here," Eleanor began, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and fear, but Croft cut her off, shoving his way aggressively inside the small cabin. "Search the place," he ordered his men with a dismissive wave of his hand. The 2 soldiers pushed past her, their faces impassive as they began tearing through the few belongings she had so carefully packed for her journey. Fury and a cold, sharp, paralyzing fear warred within her. The younger soldier, Taylor, held up her packed rucksack with a triumphant sneer. "Planning a trip, Mrs. Vance?" Croft snatched the bag from him, dumping its precious contents onto her small, rough-hewn table. "Provisions? Warm clothes. Looks like you were running off with him, your heathen lover." He grabbed her arm, his grip like an iron band. "You are coming back with us. The colonel at the fort will be very interested to talk to you." A sudden shout from outside drew their immediate attention. One of the bounty hunters burst through the door, his weathered face alight with a grim triumph. "Found fresh moccasin prints by the garden. And this." He held up a small, smooth stone carved into the perfect shape of a hawk, a simple, beautiful gift Kael had given her. Croft's face contorted with a mask of vindicated rage. "So much for your lies and deception." He turned to the other men, his eyes glinting. "Change of plans. We follow those tracks now, while they are fresh. Reynolds, you and Keller stay here with her. If she makes a sound, you silence her." As the rough, calloused hands of the bounty hunter bound her wrists tightly to a chair, Eleanor fought back with a desperate strength, her heart consumed with one single, overwhelming thought. She had to find a way to warn Kael. As the heavy sound of the 3 departing horses faded into the distance, leaving her alone with the 2 menacing bounty hunters, a desperate, wild plan formed in her mind. She had one chance. "Water," she rasped, forcing her voice to sound weak, broken, and defeated. "Please, may I have some water?" The 2 men, Reynolds and Keller, exchanged bored, indifferent glances. "Get her some." Keller grunted, leaning his long gun against the wall. As Reynolds moved to the water bucket, Eleanor began to cough, a racking, violent, theatrical sound, doubling over as much as her tight bonds would allow. "What is wrong with her?" Keller asked, taking a hesitant, uncertain step closer. "Cannot breathe," she gasped between coughs, her performance fueled by sheer terror. "The ropes, too tight on my chest." Keller, with a grumble of annoyance, grudgingly moved behind her chair to loosen the bindings. The very moment she felt the rope slacken, Eleanor exploded into a frenzy of action. She threw her head backward with all her might, connecting solidly with the bridge of his nose. As he roared in pain and surprise, she kicked out with both feet, knocking the heavy water bucket into Reynolds' eyes. In the chaotic seconds that followed, she wrenched one hand free, her fingers closing around the worn handle of the hunting knife on Keller's belt. The blade came free in her grip as she slashed at her remaining bonds. He lunged for her, blood streaming from his broken nose, but she dodged, bringing the knife up in a desperate arc. Reynolds raised his long gun, but in the small cabin he could not get a clear shot. Seizing her chance, Eleanor kicked over the oil lamp on the table. Flames leaped across the dry wood, and thick, choking smoke instantly filled the room. Eleanor burst from the smoke-filled cabin into the clean, cold autumn air, the heavy hunting knife still clutched tightly in her hand. A shot rang out from behind her, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches from her head. She did not dare to look back. She ran for the relative cover of the scrubland beyond her small, trampled garden, heading north toward the creek where Kael would be waiting for her. Behind her, she could hear the enraged shouts and curses of the two men as they stumbled out of the burning cabin, but ahead, she knew, were Croft and the soldiers. She was running directly into the jaws of the trap. Her beloved cabin, her only home for 2 years, now sent a column of black, oily smoke into the sky, an unintentional beacon of her desperate flight, a warning she prayed with every fiber of her being that Kael would see and understand. Kael saw the smoke from his high perch on the ridge, and his blood ran cold. It was too soon, and the smoke was too dark and angry. Something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. He moved down from the ridge without a sound, his body a fluid shadow against the ancient rocks, his every sense on high alert. He soon picked up the trail of the 3 riders, and he knew they were hunting him with a grim purpose. Then he heard it, carried on the wind, a single, sharp shot from the direction of the cabin. His heart seized with a cold, terrifying dread. He moved faster, his innate caution warring with a desperate, frantic urgency. A flash of movement in the brush below caught his eye. It was Eleanor, running toward their meeting place, her hair coming unbound and flying behind her like a golden banner. And closing in rapidly behind her were the 3 riders, moving to cut her off. He moved without conscious thought, his body taking over, flowing down the rocky slope with the speed and grace of an avalanche. He intercepted her just as another rifle shot cracked through the air, the bullet whining past her head. He pulled her roughly behind a massive boulder, out of the line of fire. "Kael!" she gasped, her face smudged with soot, a trickle of blood on her split lip from Croft's earlier blow. "They know. They followed you." He gently wiped the blood from her lip with his thumb, his rage a cold, hard, perfect knot in his chest. "Hush," he said softly, his voice calm despite the storm inside him. "This way, quickly." He led her up a nearly invisible game trail that wound steeply into the canyon wall. Behind them, angry shouts confirmed their pursuers had spotted them. A bullet chipped stone near his head, and he pushed her ahead, shielding her with his own body as they scrambled for their lives. They scrambled relentlessly upward, the voices of their pursuers growing more distant and frustrated below. Kael led her through a dizzying labyrinth of rock and shadow, using his intimate, lifelong knowledge of the land to create distance and confusion. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the canyons, they finally paused on a high, wind-swept ledge. They were safe for now. Far below, they could see the tiny, distant orange lights of their pursuers. Campfire, a comforting and yet menacing sight. Eleanor stood beside him, her dress torn, her face scratched and dirty, but her eyes were filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. "There is nothing left for me back there," she said, her voice steady and clear. He looked at her then, truly saw her strength and courage, and knew his own solitary path had come to a final end. He had found his trail, and it was forever intertwined with hers. "There is a place," Kael said, his voice quiet but certain as they stood together on the high ledge, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. "A hidden valley my grandfather showed me when I was a boy. No white man has ever seen it. But the journey is long and hard, especially with winter so close." Eleanor looked from the distant, hostile campfires that winked in the darkness below to the formidable, snow-dusted peaks that loomed to the north. "Is it more dangerous than staying here?" she asked, a grim, weary smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He took her hand, his grip warm and steady in the growing chill. "We will be hunted." She met his gaze without flinching, her own resolve as strong and unyielding as the ancient rock beneath their feet. "Then we must not be caught." In the fading purple light of dusk, he reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of her golden hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers lingering for just a moment against her cheek. The simple, tender touch was more intimate and meaningful than any words could ever be. "Near you," he murmured, the English words feeling both strange and profoundly right on his tongue. "I lose myself." Eleanor leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as a wave of emotion washed over her. "What do you find, Kael?" she whispered, her voice barely carried by the wind. "Home," he said simply, the single word encompassing everything he had lost and everything he now hoped for. "A feeling I thought was lost to me forever." She stepped closer then, closing the last bit of space between them, her hand coming to rest on his chest, feeling the strong, steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "I felt as if I were a ghost for so long," she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears and the weight of her long solitude. "Until you." The setting sun bathed them in a final, soft, golden light as their lips met for the very first time. It was a kiss that was gentle and questioning at first, a hesitant exploration, that then deepened with the stunning certainty of two worlds colliding not in violence, but in a profound and startling harmony that neither had ever expected to find. When they finally parted, breathless, the first stars were beginning to appear in the vast, darkening twilight sky. They had faced death and despair together, and had found in each other a powerful reason to live, a promise of a future forged together against all odds, against the hatred of an entire world. 6 months later, spring brought a riot of new life and vibrant color to the hidden valley. Wildflowers of blue, yellow, and purple carpeted the lush meadows, and a sturdy, well-built cabin stood beside a clear, cold lake that mirrored the sky. Eleanor, her face glowing with health and a deep, settled happiness, emerged from the cabin into the warm sunlight. A moment later, Kael appeared from the edge of the forest, a catch of glistening fish in his hand. He smiled as he approached, a genuine expression of peace and contentment that she now saw every day. He drew her into his arms, his love for her a warm and constant presence in their sanctuary. "I have news," she said softly, taking his hand and placing it gently on her abdomen. "By the time the snows return to the peaks, there will be 3 of us in this valley." Wonder transformed his stoic features as he knelt before her, pressing his forehead gently against the place where their child, a perfect symbol of 2 worlds made one, grew within her. They had found their home,